Oracle of the Forgotten, The Humans, The Wandering Swordsman, Part 7. In the coming weeks, so many events occurred so quickly, the two hardly had any time to breathe. The first was an attack by a demon Nalia referred to as her father. In the sense of demons, he was. He'd forced her to be born early, and his energy had corrupted her moments before her birth following his assault on her mother. In any other way, there was nothing that hinted at anything fatherly. He only saw it as ownership to claim power over her, which he also often used as bragging rights or in an outright attempt to sell her. His energies could easily bind her own, and despite fighting the best she could, she ended up wounded yet again. This demon was called Shadow. While they were fighting, he insisted that he was all there was to protect her from Marduk, or something even more sinister, claiming her. He mentioned the ceremony of birth and the Great Awakening as two events that no angel nor demon could refuse to attend, including her. That she would be broken before being presented to the gods, and her human would be sacrificed along with anyone else who was marked. He was powerful and had been considered to be a good warrior, but in the end he was no match for the human. If anything, the battle with the human ended all too quickly, with him having underestimated his opponent and leaving an opening to be sliced in half. Not only was he sliced in half, Odilon wanted to be certain he was not coming back. His first strike was followed by another. That one began breaking apart the creature's very soul. He would no longer return and never harm the half-demon again. He simply stopped existing. Still, this battle left Nalia barely able to wield her spear. Her father had used a knife to pin her to the tree, hanging by her hand. He'd also stabbed her through the shoulder again, almost directly upon the bullet wound from earlier in their adventures. Her hand could barely even close around her weapon. She felt her father's presence slip away, and something inside of her started changing as well. She couldn't place it fully. Either way, she didn't seem to be able to calm down even after they arrived in Pythos. After being bandaged, the woman decided she had to go for a walk to clear her mind. And while she was out walking without her weapon, she decided she needed to pick a fight with a priest of the New Order, but she rationalized this with herself, saying he approached her first. She found it ironic that this voice of the archangels was protected by two demons, both of which were more than eager to attack her. The town of Pythos was small enough they didn't seem to care that it was broad daylight. She stole the priest's blade in order to defend herself. She quickly learned that it was both a possessed blade and could allow another greater creature to speak through the priest. It seemed it could also speak directly to the priest and give him information about anyone who touched it. It also wasn't very long before she realized Odilon had followed her, despite her insisting she just wanted to be alone. At first she was angry, but she couldn't honestly say she wasn't happy to see him. This priest called her the Voidborn, and the human the Void Marked. Among many random revelations, he said that it was interesting to see the two were yet again united by fate. That she was only playing a role for the archangels, and they would soon be hunting her just as eagerly as they hunted him. The man also mentioned that she was meant to be part of something called the Ceremony of the Birth, and that if she sided with the angels, they could still save the humans from the plans of the mercenaries and their demon allies. When the fight slowed down, she had to think on what Velrich said. The last dragoon and the young king, who would have imagined that this would happen twice in one lifetime? The priest surprised her with yet another line, though. If the mark bears a star, then you need to take him to the oracle. I know who he is, but do you? Nalia was told that they would kill both the man and the oracle to stop the prophecy from being fulfilled. The woman tried to tell him that the new order, their group, was run by both archangels and demons, but he seemed quite insistent that demons were only the enemy. She hoped her words would have reached him, but hadn't honestly expected much. The priest Velrich was actually allowed to leave, with only minimal harm due to his cooperation and his willingness to stand down from the fight. His two demonic guards didn't exactly receive that same ending. Before Nalia and Odilon allowed this priest to leave, she decided to leave him with a message. He creates his own destiny, and so do I. They will have to find a new king. You tell your gods that the dragoon took the air and will kill any who comes near him. This actually led to quite a lengthy discussion between the two later about her past and what she honestly did or did not know. Eventually, the guards informed her that at least temporarily she would have to leave Pythos. At some point during these times, the two did find themselves becoming lovers, although they tried their best to keep others from noticing it for as long as they could. They decided to resume their travels to Renegade, making it most of the way to the city. Another attack, this time by a demonic sorcerer, brought the revelation that witches could become powerful dark archmages among the demon realms. His interest to this realm resulted in the agonizing deaths of two guards near the gate of Renegade itself. The sorcerer was named Zogaroth, a name muttered by Nalia despite her not knowing where she'd found it. He was more skilled in magic than the girl and used this to mostly keep her subdued through the coming battle, at least as far as keeping her powers at bay. Zogorath found it fascinating that the girl knew his name. This is a relatively uncommon ability even among demons. He chose to fight them, but at the same time tried to convince them that he knew the destiny of them both. She was to be a part of something called the Ceremony of the Birth, and later be presented before the gods as a powerful being like himself. The human, he would be sacrificed along with all the others who were already chosen. It was nearly impossible to ignore that both sides, supposedly enemies, had wanted the pair at the same event. Despite this demon having more skill and experience in magic, Nalia had managed to free herself from a spell he used to bind her body from fighting. Odilon took care of the two demons who had been left guarding him. One seemed to be entirely obsessed with the sword that the human held. He continued to try to talk the human out of it before attempting to steal it for himself. That action was his last and resulted in his own end. Nalia finally started to show off a little of the magic that she was refusing to use. As a witch, she'd always kept that side hidden. Demons might be hated, but witches were hated nearly as much. She didn't want more bigotry against her. Still, the magic she could use was minor compared to the demon. One of the spells was a rooting spell. It bound the demon for a short time to the ground, allowing her to step further away from him. It wasn't strong enough to hold him for long, but it bought her a few seconds' time. She barely escaped, once again cursing the fact that the swordsman had to rescue her from two things: the demon and a newfound source of pain she'd never experienced before. Before disappearing through a portal, Zogorath appeared behind the girl and fed a massive amount of magical energy into the right side of her upper back. A mark began to burn through the flesh at the back of her upper right shoulder. The sensation was excruciating, especially with the force of the demon pouring nothing but non-human energy through it. After the demon had left, Odilon tried to talk to her and comfort her about this marking. He'd noticed it the days before, but assumed that she'd always known about it. After all, why wouldn't she? The two had already healed most of the wounds from their previous battles, except for damage to Nalia's left arm and a new-formed set of scars on the swordsman. They decided to recover from this recent battle at the inn inside Renegade, and then they got to talking about the Void Mark, the old church, and the new order. Odilon's attention was drawn by something she had to say about his hometown. There used to be honor and tryst. Valen must have died. Beowulf would never have gone against him if he'd been living. The woman seemed to know the city better than she'd first implied. Valen had been ill for a long time before his passing. Most of them thought he was gone years ago. Beowulf is good for those he cares for, but it's extremely limited. Odilon had seen that himself, but he'd always been treated well by the man. He wasn't about to question what she had to say. Rather, he asked again if she knew anything else about these markings. You'll be hunted to the end of the earth. Either conquer and live or fail and die. It won't change much for me, really. However, they will always know where we are. The second we're close, they will sense us, the same as we can sense them. She closed her eyes a moment before stretching. It doesn't matter. It was going to happen. A note slid beneath their door, but neither one had noticed. She'd begun to speak again when a voice in her mind spoke instead. Read the note. The note itself was about a bounty. It seemed women from the village were going missing without a trace, and it had gotten to where the daughter of one of the officials was now also gone. Nalia realized this could just as easily be a trap as anything else, but the two decided to talk it over anyway. Odilon knew she was still energetically exhausted from the battle, so he told her that they should eat before making a decision. When he went to get them food from downstairs, the man was approached by a rather young human boy with brown hair and golden eyes. He knew the kid pretty well. They'd once worked together in the same group and had actually traveled together to the lands of Tamal. Jacob was a good kid. He always worked hard and trained hard. Odilon had liked him well enough, and the boy seemed to be genuinely excited to see him. After glancing around to see if anyone else was around, he took some time to speak with the teenager. The teen had seen the army, and he asked how the man had managed to survive. It wasn't easy, but it's better that I stay dead. Odilon wanted to say more, but he also didn't want to hurt the younger man. After all, this boy was dedicated to the group, and he knew that they treated him well. Are you leaving? Does Beowulf know? Jacob was always one for making sure everyone was okay. It was admirable, but somewhat naive in the swordsman's opinion. A part of him really wanted to steer the boy away from the chance of betrayal, but a lot of them had grown up in the city and had no idea how to work in the rest of the world. I didn't leave. I was left. It was all that he could come up with. Careful that you don't suffer the same. Just keep your eyes open. He hoped what he had to say was enough. The boy seemed to understand. If nothing else, he didn't follow the man upstairs, trying to keep talking with him. The fact that he's run into several people from his village in the past weeks was starting to bother him. He knew that it was likely in a city this size, but eventually word would get back to the other mercenaries. It wouldn't be long before he had to go and talk with them about his future. Frankly, he was wanting to keep Nalia as far away from Gawain as humanly possible. While he was out, Nalia had been studying the letter. Random symbols would pop into her mind on occasion. The paper itself felt strange to her, as if it weren't even from here. There was a second energy she was trying to understand as well, and finally a single phrase came to mind. A broken earth. It didn't make much sense to her. She explained to Odilon that this request to save the kidnapped women had come from something non-human. It was sending occasional messages, including the one about the broken earth. It's odd enough to request. Even the bounty offices would not normally deliver at your door. She wasn't sure if she wanted to take this or not. The money was really good, and she couldn't focus her energy enough for her visions to tell her anything useful. If it's non-human, we should handle it. He didn't really care, but he knew if there were others that they could question about these events, maybe they could learn enough to prevent any more problems. They kept insisting the two couldn't avoid it no matter how hard they tried, and he would rather be prepared than not. I can get their attention. She stretched slightly. Her left hand was still healing and her arm was still bandaged. She couldn't fight like she wanted to, but she could still fight if she needed to. Plus, she knew she had their magic. If they're after young women without my horns, I don't think it's a good idea. He didn't mean to sound so irritated, but he was. He wasn't even sure why it was making him uneasy. She's a good fighter. She can handle these things on her own. I can hide the horns. I need a dress, so I'll have to go shopping. If anything, she couldn't even remember the last time she'd worn a dress. They weren't great for combat, and she always felt better with the freedom to move and fight properly. The market square was also where many of the ladies had disappeared from. In fact, a particular tailor shop seemed to be suffering since many of the girls had last been seen there and then disappeared shortly after. That was where the pair began, with Nalia in the shop and Odilon waiting outside of her, as so many of the town's men often did. When Nalia stepped out of the shop, she changed into her new dress, a soft cream-colored top with a blue-fitted bodice and skirt. It wasn't any different than most of the other ladies in town, but on her, she seemed to develop a regal air. It was as if she were some hidden noble traveling the town in disguise. It seemed that he wasn't the only one to notice, as a young man approached him to talk. Nalia could see him from across the courtyard. Whoever it was talking to him, they were wearing a symbol of the mercenary camp. Nalia was walking towards him when a young lady pulled her aside. This girl must have been a teenager. She was slender with dark hair and brown eyes. The girl told her that they were both being followed. She was begging Nalia to let her walk with her, and for both of them to get out of the market and get away from the city. The half-demon talked to her for a bit, trying to get more information. Nalia found out she was 19, which is considered an old maid by this town. Odilon had been told by the man from Trist that they wanted him to return to talk to Baelith and Gawain. They were actually demanding he come to talk before there was any trouble. The swordsman dismissed him, saying that he would if there was time, but maybe they shouldn't hold their breath waiting. The girl who had pulled Nalia aside followed her, clinging to her arm even into the center of the town square. Nalia sighed and offered to call the guard if she really needed some protection. You're strong, right? You can help me. The young woman's words made Nalia look closer at her. There was no reason for the teen to know anything about her. She started to speak, but actually didn't have the time. Odilon saw a man rush past him towards the girls. He realized that the one talking to him might just be a distraction. He already was on the move. At the same moment, a wagon burst from the nearby side street into the square. Even in the broad daylight, the wagon rushed up beside the girls, and the two were grabbed by a group of men from inside. Nalia began to fight back, despite her damaged left hand. She took a swing at one of the men trying to pick her up. Another struck her from behind. In the short time that she was dizzy, they'd already loaded her into the wagon, and all 4 horses were put to running. The half-demon shook her head, trying to kick her way loose. She glanced over to see the teenager beside her was already bound in ropes. As she was struggling to escape, she felt the unfamiliar burning in her shoulder. One of the men stopped. "Chains on this one." Then nothing more was said. Before long, she found herself chained in the back of the wagon. She would have considered that to not be a problem, but these chains had a faint glow about them. Her head was beginning to pound, and she was dizzier than ever before she saw her horns move back into her own view. The man who had told them to chain her leaned in close to look her in the eyes. "It's not much fight for a demon." "You aren't human." The words slipped from her lips unexpectedly. The man had already known that she wasn't either. He said nothing more. Instead, he took a seat next to the girls. Nalia hated using her powers this way, but she extended her energy outward, trying to see what exactly she was up against. For a brief moment, she saw a flash. His wings began to fade into view, soft white feathers. His light blonde hair suddenly made more sense, but why would an angel be kidnapping women? The man finally looked over her and laughed. "Careful, girl. The more magic you use." Still, he couldn't say he wasn't impressed. She hadn't just scanned him. His entire disguise had fallen apart while she was trying to figure out what he was. All of this with magically restrictive chains on her. If she had the power to remove it, she was going to be an interesting one to present to their leader. Odilon knew that she'd had a plan. He didn't exactly realize she intended to not only be bait, but allow herself to be captured as well. He was already angry that he'd been distracted from enjoying how good she looked in that dress. It seemed like a strange miracle how regal she managed to look, as if something in her demeanor had entirely changed with her clothing. But as he saw the wagon pull in and the girl whisked away, he couldn't help but push the man distracting him away and start after the wagon. Not that he could have kept up with that many horses, but it had to have been a terrifying sight to the locals. His speed was unnatural, and there were reasons behind it. One of those was a very long time training in a place no human dared to escape alive. None but himself. The swordsman sped behind the wagon, keeping it in sight for the entire time it sped out of town, and well into the depths of the forest. As it traversed deeper into the woodlands, he was left with only a trail itself to follow. The horses couldn't run forever. They'd clearly slowed down at some point. The ruts of the wagon got deeper, running through some of the mud as it entered near the river, and then continued on to what looked like a cottage and farm in the distance. The swordsman wasn't sure by this point if he was more angry that they were so far out in the woods, so close to the city, or that Nalia had let herself be taken and not stopped this quite a bit earlier. She was unarmed and absolutely not incapable of fighting. Little did he know. In the basement beneath the building was Nalia in a small caged area with 6 other women. She no longer had the ability to hide her horns, but it seemed like she no longer cared. She'd been left down there with 2 guards that she knew were angels. One from before had disguised himself again. The second never lost his disguise, but the longer she was around them, the more intense the sensation of burning through her shoulder had become. She was finally figuring out how to use her magic to lessen the pain from the void mark that was now on her body. As she glanced again at the other girls, she realized one was actually pregnant. The others were slim, young, and many looked terrified. One looked as though she hadn't eaten in days. Most of them had torn clothes, many from the same shop that she'd bought hers from. The half-demon started asking the girls their story. It seemed it was similar, though the wagon never came into the center of town. Normally they were just dragged away and disappeared, But the newer dark-haired girl managed to somehow escape her captors, and that set them off trying to find ways to keep her from telling the guard what was going on. It's pretty sloppy. Nalia muttered, then glanced at the bars. The chains on her hands weren't hindering her movement much, but something about this place had her feeling like she needed to escape, and quickly. "Hey, guys, do you have any water?" Nalia's voice was heard above the soft whispering between the girls. They'd separated off from her in part due to her strange appearance. "For a demon?" The man directly across from the door scoffed. "Please, you're lucky we even put you in with the others. We should have put you down." He was no help. Nalia glanced at the man she'd seen earlier. "The girl, she's pregnant. If you don't get her at least some water and maybe some food, she might end up dying. You realize that, right?" She didn't genuinely know whether or not they'd listen to her. After all, they seemed to be waiting on something else. "For the pregnant one? Why would you care?" The angel was curious mostly. After all, they've all been told the evils of demons. Nalia realized in that moment he might not know the truth about his own people either. "I'm a demon, not an ass like you guys." She shrugged, then walked over to examine the pregnant girl a moment before shaking her head. "Some of them are injured. Do you even care? You call yourself angels. You could at least heal them." "They'll be taken care of by the ethereal market." The man's words made Nalia freeze a moment. She'd been kneeling next to the pregnant girl when suddenly she felt it. Her eyes began to shift darker. A coldness seemed to blow around the girl, nowhere near the kind the swordsman was capable of. But she stood up slowly and turned towards the immortal across from her. "The ethereal market is the dark realms, my realms. Why would you be trading with my people?" Words just slipped from her now. It felt like someone else was speaking more than herself. The fade of the deep shadows dripped off her form as she took a step towards the gates. "Zeke, could you please get these chains active?" The man across the door was half questioning and half pleading now. Zeke sighed and snapped his fingers. For a brief moment the chains flashed, and so did Nalia. A sharp pain shot through her body, causing her to fall to her knees as her void mark began to burn away at part of her shirt. She growled slightly, shaking her head before forcing herself to stand again. Water for the girl. She was still demanding they listen to her, despite her entire body aching from the force of the suppression magic in those chains. "Well now, Argath, that is strange." Zeke suddenly walked towards the cage door himself before glancing over the woman again. "You aren't a demon. What are you?" Nalia blinked. She could sense the swordsman now, and he was still a good distance from the cottage, but being in her field of perception meant it couldn't be more than 15 minutes before he arrived. She knew this meant that he could sense the void mark, and they could as well, or likely could. She tried to amp up the power of her own marking to try to cover the presence of the second one. Half demon, half witch. Any more stupid questions? She somehow felt it wasn't what he was after. She didn't really care. "Give me the water. I'll even take his." She motioned towards the dented metal canister next to the first guard. The guard shook his head. "Fine." He stepped closer to the bars to hand it over to her. What he didn't see, and probably should have, was how easily this girl had just tricked him. While the chains prevented aggressive magics, she was hoping it didn't prevent all magics. As her right hand reached for the canister, the left dragged his sword towards herself and replaced it with an illusion. The guard's sword was drawn so quickly to her side. Once secure, she kept it hidden from the view of both men as she turned to face the other girls. She muttered an insincere-sounding thanks before handing the girls the water. You need to sit her up. She's badly dehydrated, so don't let her drink too quickly. With that, the girl was ready to face her next challenge, hiding the stupid sword until the swordsman got there. It's a pretty cute trick, Nalia. The voice from the stairs was unexpected, but his knowing her name made her hands shake slightly. She closed her eyes a moment as she spoke, her energy scanning quickly over the room. Rather than meeting with an answer, it felt like her own energy came flashing back, crashing into her again and making her drop the sword as the chains activated to send another pulse of energy through her body. Who? The girl could barely stand. As the sword hit the ground, her illusion spell broke. The combination of pain from her own marking and the chains was just too much for the girl to really bear, but it didn't stop her from reaching down and picking the blade back up before standing slowly. The stranger watched her closely with a slightly sadistic grin. Her pain was something beautiful, and somehow she wore it well, still fighting back the best she could. Argath was instantly angry, starting towards the cage door to open it, hoping to recover his sword. Stay where you are, guard. Into the basement stepped a man who was easily as tall as Odilon, even in this human form. He glanced into the cage and then held a hand out towards her. Sword. It was a command. The white-haired man was demanding the weapon back. Her purple eyes locked on him. His eyes, though, angels often had gold, green, or blue eyes. This one had purple eyes similar to her own. Who are you, and how do you... She wanted to ask more questions, but a snap of his fingers caused her to kneel on the ground again. Sword, princess. I said give me the sword. The angel was growing more and more impatient. He shifted slightly. All 6 of his large wings formed out to lay against his back. He looked the girl over slowly as he shook his head. If you obey this one command, we can talk. By now, the swordsman was very close, maybe even outside. Nalia gave a playful grin, then stood up with the sword. She spun quickly, launching it back towards its original owner. To her surprise, the sword suddenly stopped mid-air and moved back to the hand that was waiting for it. Such a child. The tone just made her want to hit him. Still, she sighed and looked at the immortal again. You have your sword. Who are you? That's all you want to know about. Not why you're here. Not how I knew who you are. Not why I'm going to kill that man upstairs outside of this hut after he decimates about half the guard in this building. The man paced back and forth as he spoke. He was honestly just analyzing the situation aloud. Good luck with that. She knew Odilon wasn't to be taken so trivially, and she wanted her answers. She still felt that he was suggesting something impossible with the human. Fine. Who are you, and how the hell do you know my name? The man grinned and tapped the sword against the side of the cage before handing it back to its rightful owner. Your father was a good commander. I'm not sure how she remembered the name he gave her for you. The man shrugged, then looked her over. Shame you've been corrupted. We may have to fix that. However, the sounds of fighting upstairs drew his attention. Oh look, your toy is here. Just know you belong among the seraphim, not the demons. Nalia stood there staring blankly as the man began his all-too-casual walk towards the stairs. Odilon had freed the horses and dropped a wheel off the carriage for now. He then turned towards the building. Only moments before he had sensed Nalia's pain. He could feel the pull of two immortals and one much more powerful being, and a small group of lesser angels that were waiting in the cabin. The man adjusted his clothing, then took the blade into his hand before he just knocked on the door. As the door began to open, he kicked it hard, sending whatever man or angel that was behind it flying across the room. The door cracked, shifting to drop off the top hinge, which had been torn away. The commotion drew the eyes of dozens of men, some angels, some mortals. Each one was armed, and they began to rush forward to fight off this intruder. The man downstairs was starting to approach the first step when Nalia spoke again, finding her words in a way she hadn't before. "Tell me then, angel, if I'm not a demon and not an angel, what am I?" She growled a little and then started towards the cage doors. Zeke raised his hand to snap his fingers when the angel spoke again. "Let her, Zeke. After all, she's the High Commander's child. She should know." He said nothing more for a moment before walking back to the cage and staring directly into the girl's eyes. "You are an abomination, a mistake, the product of forbidden nonsense of a man who couldn't understand that humans are toys, not lovers." His words reminded her of ice and venom. He continued to speak, seeming more irritated with each word, and because of his position, "We aren't allowed to kill you. We have to take you back to be evaluated, and look at you, disgusting. The demons corrupted you. You're worth nothing like this. You will be purified or destroyed." My real father was a Templar for the old church. Her words may have been spoken softly, but they carried the conviction of her mother and the villagers that had told them to her. She walked up to look him in the eyes. "You'll see your prophecies are wrong, and you'll have to come to respect him and me. Your father was a brilliant leader, a seraph, and an idiot for thinking that bitch deserved love." He stared her in the eyes a moment and watched the silent rage growing behind them. He knew he only had to push her a little further. The woman stepped right up to the bars of the cage now. "Father was dead before I was born. Mother, you can speak of however you wish, but you will respect me." Her tone had changed, and the angel grinned as he heard the two guards step away. He looked down at her again and smiled. "Oh, the gods will enjoy having you for the ceremony." Without another word, he turned and walked away. "Get back here." She started to pull at the bars of the cage, bending them slightly near the door when Zeke reached up to snap his fingers again. But this time, something went horribly wrong for the angel. Odilon had already easily killed over half the men upstairs. Parts of them were strewn everywhere. The angels who tried to shift form to gain more power had left bloody feathers and torn wings scattered around the room. He ran forward, hopping onto a nearby chair and then high into the air. The human dropped, landing on one of the better guards and splitting him in half down the middle, and then he spun to the side, tearing apart another less trained warrior halfway through the waist. He felt it, moving slowly up the stairs. What surprised him wasn't the seraph. was the fact that he'd already shifted to show his wings, already taken one of his power forms, albeit a smaller one. The second thing was those purple eyes, not something he ever expected to see among their kind. Still, he wasn't here to play any games. Where are the women? He wasn't even going to begin to ask for Nalia. He thought it might give this immortal too much leverage. And the humans? Downstairs. But don't you mean the princess instead? The seraph began to circle around the man, hoping to find a better vantage point. He drew his sword, which was covered entirely in pure white flames, before continuing. Really a shame, though. She has your stench all over her. Had there been a flicker of hope for conversation, that phrase made it die. The human wasn't sure what he meant, but if he'd laid a hand on her in any way, he was going to suffer eternally for whatever he had done. The seraph ran towards the mortal. White flames trailed along behind him as he moved. While he was fast, he was shocked to learn the mortal was actually faster. The human had dodged his attack, easily spinning to cut a pretty sizable hole into one of his wings. Interesting. The seraph stood tall, stretched slightly before he adjusted his stance. A mortal with skill. The two continued slashing and cutting at one another. The seraph had managed to cut into Odilon's left arm, break one of his pauldrons, and completely shatter his gauntlet, all on that same side. The human knew that the immortal was intentionally attacking his weaker side, but that only made it more interesting. He lifted his blade, rushing the creature again, and then in an odd twist, spun the exact opposite direction that he normally did. His blade met with the blade of the angel, which skidded across it and left the two staring at each other. Ice-cold white eyes met purple ones, and the human spoke again. Back down, or die. Where are they? He knew his answer. The sound from downstairs of Nalia being electrocuted by the chains was enough to drive him half mad. Do you hear her, mortal? Just imagine the sounds your little lover would make beneath a worthy creature, or even a god. He'd meant to enrage the mortal, but instead he did something no one had ever done before. He broke something. The sword suddenly spoke, and it was as if time stopped for everyone. For a brief instant, the air was filled with a disembodied voice. It's time to stand down. Know your place, Talgara. The words didn't come from the mortal, but as he heard them, the emotions simply stopped. They were not spoken in the human tongue, yet he understood every word despite that. His insides were now ice. Nothing mattered but his target. The angel, though, how did you know my name? He growled, pushing the mortal away and standing back to point his blade at him. Only this energy. He didn't see just the mortal. Something stood behind him, something holding a ball of energy in its hand. Something truly ancient. This being was only watching. He wanted to test this mortal himself, and in his hand he held the only thing he felt would distract him the most in the moment. The mortal was fully cold. He didn't even answer Talgara. Instead, he rushed the man, swinging his blade at the legs, arms, and eventually spinning back to impact and cut off the angel's left middle wing entirely. A moment later, he spun back again to slice deeply into the top right one, before backing away to see two wings crash to the ground. The angel screamed loudly and then ran forward to attack again. Despite the human hearing Nalia scream in pain while Zeke had shocked her, she suddenly stood up for herself. The pale blue-white energy flickered through her form like lightning, even going so far as to light up her skeleton and expose the wings she'd kept hidden from the world. You want to know something funny about Seraph prison chains? She was talking, but it didn't seem like the same girl they'd captured at all. How are you even standing? Zeke motioned for the other guard to move closer to him, and the girl simply smiled. They work better on angels and demons than hybrids. She spoke and then snapped her fingers. The chains fell off of her and then suddenly appeared on the two directly across from her, binding their arms together. Then Zeke's blade appeared in her left hand, while his keys appeared in the right. This was impossible. The chains should have held, but when they looked over the girl, her eyes were now white again. She reached a hand out, unlocking the cell door, and then threw the keys to the girls. Take care of each other. She walked towards the two angels, blade in hand ready to strike, when she suddenly heard a sound. The symbol on her right shoulder began to burn. At the same time, Odilon's began to bleed, but he was mid-strike and the seraph across from him found another wing missing. This left only his two lowest wings, and the angel stepped back again. What are you? Where did you find that blade? I am the judgment of the old king. The words had spilled from his lips as he rushed forward, cutting the last two wings from the seraph. And you will go in your shame back to your masters and tell them neither of us are theirs to toy with. And if they do not leave humanity alone, I will hunt them all down. This was not at all the voiceless sword. It was Odilon's voice. The entity that had so long traveled with him spoke quickly. Basement portal. With that, the apparition disappeared, and a swirl of blue-black energy went into the blade again. At the mention of the portal, the wingless angel summoned a small emergency portal beneath himself and allowed himself to fall through. Nalia had kept the angels busy as the girls had untied themselves. The burning in her heart grew hotter yet as she felt her body start to stumble slightly. The pain was almost too much. A crystal formed behind the two angels. A hand reached out and dragged them through. Her eyes settled on the opening portal. This one was different. This was white, formed of hundreds, even thousands of silver, white, and blue crystals. The portal shimmered and flickered blue, and then back to white as it continued to further itself into their world. Nalia paused and then raised a hand. Her own power had been increased for some reason. She couldn't fully understand why. A field of deep blue energy surrounded the cage, locking the girls into what looked like a glass container, but still not hindering their breathing. The woman took a step towards the portal and then saw the swordsman coming down the stairs. Her heart skipped for a moment, and she nearly lost focus on her energy works. She drew up the sword she had taken and stepped away from the portal again. The swordsman didn't even speak to her. Rather, he rushed downstairs and pushed her back harshly from the portal. Odilon. The half-demon was hesitant now. She had no idea what was going on. From the portal swung a large red and gold sword, carved with intricate designs of flames and fires. It was nearly, but not quite, as large as what the swordsman held, and it flickered and glowed with some hidden energy. It swung, crashing through the room, cutting through a small stack of barrels and nearby second cage. Behind it, a large man stepped in, barely even able to stand in the basement room. He glanced around, and his eyes settled on the woman at first, and then Odilon, who was already rushing forward to strike him. The strike flew under the swinging blade, cutting deeply into the celestial armor that the angel wore, but not really damaging him any. The creature grinned as it formed up fully into the room. He was strong and powerful. He barely fit the room, but he wouldn't have cared if he hadn't. All he cared about was his target. The girls were still here. They could make their sale, and only a human guarding them? Still, his eyes settled on Nalia a moment, before turning back to the swordsman and then settling entirely on his blade. "Seems you have something not yours, human." His words were so typical of the non-humans. "You all say that, and none prove worthy to take it." Odilon spoke quickly. "Fight or leave. Your choice. Leave or die." "I'll leave once I have what I came for." He walked towards the women until he heard Odilon growl and run at him. In the narrow confines of this space, he wouldn't have been able to move much, so when the human rushed him, he drew his sword forward, blocking the black blade. The metals grew hot again, and the red-gold blade seemed to flicker several colors before switching to a deep black with red flickering symbols. The man stepped back, spinning to slash at the human. This time, as their blades crossed, he leaned in a bit closer. "Blood magic, the taint of the void. What are you, mortal?" Being so close to the mortal, he suddenly grinned and pushed his blade forward, crashing the human's blade back into his face for a moment. Odilon seemed to barely notice. He had somehow managed to turn his blade so that it barely even cut his face in the action. There was, however, going to be a pretty good bruise. Nalia was trying to give them space and then realized the situation. She lowered the energy field around the girls. Upstairs and out the exit now. She couldn't sense anything, but even if they were recaptured, the guards wouldn't likely do anything to them. As she helped them escape, Odilon raced towards the entity, this time slamming him through the wall behind him. The nearby portal shook. The master of it had sustained pretty heavy cuts from the wood and stone. A section of wall struck through the angel's ribs, and the force of the blow had knocked him into an old tunnel that had been sealed off some ages ago. Odilon blocked the exit with his body as the girls began their escape. Nalia had most of them already upstairs when the angel suddenly took a piece of wood out of its chest and bolted towards them. The sword in his hand swung at the mortal while he threw the blood-soaked wood towards Nalia. The wood hit her sideways and pushed her back, knocking her into the nearby cage. While Odilon had caught the angel's blade, he began to be pushed back into the main part of the room again. The entity spoke up a moment. "You aren't worth my time." He swung his sword again, spinning back to slam his blade against the mortal and knocking him past the shimmering white portal. Somehow, the human managed to hit the wall next to it. Nalia stood back up. Her eyes were once again purple and her power levels were lower than she wanted. She stared at the giant of a man before raising the sword the angel had left behind. She suddenly just smiled at the creature, even though she could see Odilon trying to pull himself out of the debris from the more solid wall. "Is something funny, little girl?" The angel didn't care at all for this. He walked towards her with his sword aimed at her. "You will be coming with me now." "Oh, I just realized. A priest held a sword nearly exactly like this one." The girl ran her hand over the blade. White light flickered and flashed from it, causing her arms to almost instantly catch fire. Before long, she rolled beneath the blade of the man near her. She jumped up, spinning the slice at his shoulder and upper back, before landing on the ground nearby. Odilon watched her with a slight curiosity, but seemed unemotional otherwise. The two began taking turns fighting this larger creature. After the pair managed to knock his blade away, the angel demanded that they stop and listen. Nalia walked over to take the red gold blade from the ground. It was huge, but she really couldn't complain. It felt good in her hand. "Tell the girl whatever she wants to know." The words from Odilon sounded so cold, and Nalia wasn't sure how to feel about it. "What is the ceremony of the birth, and what is the Great Awakening?" She needed to know. Something in her just seemed to churn at the mention of either one. "Shame that you know about them already. Ruins the surprise." The creature was trying to recover. He'd lost an arm in the fight already. Because the girl had used magic to destroy the remains, he'd have to regrow it, and it was a slow process. "I didn't ask that. Answer my question. What are they?" Nalia was feeling something, sensing it off the edges of her awareness, and she could sense the girls standing around the broken wagon. "Be quick about it. The leader of the Hand of Gods will be released. A new god will be born into this world, and you, Princess, could be a part of it all." At the last statement, Nalia slashed at him quickly. "No opinions, only facts. What is the Great Awakening?" The half-demon was quite quickly losing her patience. "Demon nonsense. They'll be calling their gods too. No non-human can avoid it. You will be there, whether a prisoner, a guest, or one of the sacrifices. You aren't too late to join us. Our king will still need a bride." Had Odilon been able to feel in the moment, it would have enraged him. Rather, the man took a step closer. "If you don't stay to the point, you die." Nalia could sense the difference. Something was wrong. His emotions were somewhere that he couldn't reach them, and she couldn't even sense them. She wanted to look into it more, but before she could speak, a light shot out from where the angel stood. It launched like a spear through her left arm, pulling her in closer to it as it began wrapping around her arm and then spinning quickly around her body. She found herself dragged back towards the angel, and she growled before using the angelic blade to slash through this material. As soon as she did, a large glowing hand made of energy surrounded her body and dragged her closer to the stranger. He suddenly wrapped his arm around her, taking the blade from her hand and then starting towards the portal. Odilon was still shut down emotionally. He ran forward, stabbing the man holding her. He almost stabbed her too. Her dress shredded along one side as his sword grazed her hip. She tried to stay silent, feeling it tearing into her flesh, and she resisted the urge to simply scream. When her eyes met his, she understood. He was there, but he just wasn't. "Odilon, we should go." It wasn't something she wanted to tell him. They still needed to eliminate the man holding her. He must be one of their leaders. She didn't expect the sensation that came over her next. The human grabbed her and spun her away from his target. He didn't even speak to her. He just kept stabbing the blade in deeper. This time she got to see it, the way it all too quickly devoured every drop of blood from this creature. Even its bones were dry. The angel began to break apart, crashing into white glowing ash on the ground. Nalia took a step back, a little too close to the portal. Another hand reached through, and she only had enough time to summon the golden blade from the ground. She spun, slicing the hand in two. This only forced yet another to pop from the portal, this time grabbing the blade while the original reformed and tried to wrap around her. The human swordsman seemed to catch on quickly how to solve this. He shoved Nalia to the side as he slashed away at the hands and then raised his sword one more time. This time it went crashing through the crystals of the portal. There was an explosion. Nalia felt herself fly back against the prison bars again. The human felt himself fly into a nearby wall. Both felt their own marks start to die down. It was quiet for now. The portal's shattering had left the ground covered in blue and white crystals. Nalia set a hand gently on Odilon's arm. He'd not moved since breaking the portal. Suddenly he looked into her eyes again. She wasn't sure what he was going to do. His mark was telling her to kill him. She was terrified that he might turn on her as well. But he didn't. Instead, he placed the sword away and picked up the large golden blade as he turned away. The woman sighed, placing the weapon she'd stolen away. She took a few steps closer and set her hand on his arm again. He suddenly reached up a hand as if he were about to strike her, and then a blue orb dropped from nowhere, landing at his feet. He blinked, his motions frozen, and then he reached out a hand to gently touch her face. "We need to go. Do you need me to carry you?" To Nalia, it was a bit of whiplash. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. She refused. Instead, she tore some loose cloth off her shirt under her dress and tied off the wound in her arm. Odilon watched her and sighed. "We should get back." He wasn't sure how to deal with what just happened. His emotions were still barely working right now, and he would have struck her just to get her to let him go. He realized none of that was normal. So in silence, he walked back upstairs and back out of the house. Odilon took the time to put the wagon back together and rounded up a horse or two to pull it. The girls would at least have a ride back to town. The pregnant one especially was in no condition to make that walk now. He figured he would be able to escape his own thoughts for a bit. After collecting the bounty and dropping off the girls, the two went back to the inn they stayed at. It wasn't long before they were back to checking on each other's wounds again. It was Nalia who decided to talk to Odilon about his strange moment of no emotions. His only reasoning was that they were interfering and they'd been removed for a time. Some part of her was a bit jealous, but another was actually somewhat scared. Either way, there was nothing she could really say. He'd managed not to harm her too much, and even the soft cut above her hip wasn't life-threatening. Considering the situation, it could have been much worse. He seemed to be feeling guilty and upset about it, but there was something even bigger on his mind. "I need you to promise to stay here in Renegade for a while. If I don't return, you're going to travel onward. I'll find you again." He didn't want her to follow him, especially with the way he feared things would go when he returned to Trist. "I can't do that." The half-demon looked him over a moment, then stared into his eyes. She was searching for a clue of what was going on. "It's not that major. Just stay for a week, then start towards Trask if I'm not here. I'll catch up." He was hoping to avoid it, but the way she was looking at him, he knew she had questions. "I have business in Trist, and I don't want you there." "Are you certain?" It was all she could say. She was hurt to be left out, hurt to think of being separated from him, but she was feeling something about Trist, something telling her she needed to go there. "No matter what happens, do not go to Trist. I can track you down, but it's not the place for you." Odilon was more concerned about what Gawain would do than anything, but when they turned in the bounty on the girls, her bounty was high enough that even Baelith would struggle not to turn her in and collect the money himself. He tried again to get her to promise him if he didn't return, she would move on to the next city and avoid the mercenaries from Trist wherever possible. Leaving her alone wasn't something he wanted to do, but he needed to sort this betrayal so he could move on with whatever they wanted to plan together. It took longer than he wanted to convince her, but eventually Nali agreed to at least continue on her travels if he didn't turn up fast enough. She had intended to follow him anyway, but something in her told her that it wouldn't matter if she did or didn't, so she chose to at least honor her promise to him. She could barely stand the thought of being apart, but she understood it might be the best they can hope for if they want to continue this journey. All she could really hope was that this journey didn't get any more complicated for them both.